How's it going, ladies?
Hi, Cameron.
Good morning, Cam.
Morning, Derek. I think it's Derek. Is it Derek or is it Josh?
It is Derek today,
All right.
although Josh may appear at some point.
Well, good to have you. And get myself ready. Am I in? Doing anything fun this summer, Derek?
Yeah. We had a week off from Hutton Monument, and with that time, got to celebrate my wife's birthday, and some things just worked out really well over that week. So
Awesome. Here. Good morning, Analia. Thanks for joining. Okay. Give me just a minute here. Derek, did you have anything specifically that you would like to cover today? Hold on just a second. Computer, stop.
not anything in specific.
Okay. Analia, did you have anything that you want to cover today? And then I guess Brandy and Ray, or Jay, I don't know why I said Ray. Same thing for you. Do you ladies have anything specific that you want to cover today?
No, I'm holding down the fort. She's, I think, making an order in the other room. I'm not sure what she's doing, but no, if you could just like open the top of my brain and pour it all in, that'd be helpful.
All right. We'll work on that and get her known. I forgot that I was messing around with things on my end, so my Memorial Designer is actually all messed up. So I just have to reinstall it here really quick and get it fixed. So give me just a minute.
Whatever you teach me, I'm sure will be new
All right.
information.
Probably new for me too. I had a customer asking about showing how to show VSUNC lettering without any litho in it, so I can talk about that today if anybody's interested. Aaron, good morning. How's it going?
Morning, going pretty good.
I'm running just a bit late. I forgot I've been messing around with my installation, so it's all messed up. So I'm reinstalling things real quick.
Huh, fun.
The joys of always trying to test things out. Doing anything exciting this summer, Aaron?
Not yet. I'll be taking vacation in a couple weeks. Not sure what I'm gonna do with it yet, but
Yeah, nice. It's exciting.
I mean, better than working it either way.
My boys had a swim meet this last weekend, so we drove up to Gillette, Wyoming, which is about 4 or 5 hours north of us. I've lived here my whole life pretty much, but I've never been to Devil's Tower, so
Oh,
ended up
cool.
Devil's Tower and then shot over to South Dakota to see Mount Rushmore and the surrounding areas over there too. So
Excellent.
it was good fun. Okay. Analia asked about how to filter fonts, so we can talk about that. See if everything's opening up here. Anything specifically you'd like to cover today, Aaron?
Let me look at my program. I feel like there was something I had a question about.
Okay.
Let's see. I can't think of it at the moment, but if I think of it, I'll bring it up.
Okay, sounds good. Let's start with font filtering, since Annalie was asking about that. Let me share my screen. Okay, everybody able to see my Corel Draw here?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, font filtering. If you go to the text tool, up here is the font drop down. Under the font drop down, the second option over there is hide filter list or show filter list. That's going to pop up the filters over here. And there's a bunch of filters that are auto created. I don't typically use the majority of these. But I suppose if you really needed to find, Turkish text, you could click that button and see which ones have Turkish text, something like that. But the reason for filters is, as you can see, I've got 2052 fonts installed on my machine, and maybe I want to filter that list down to something more specific. In my case, I've added folders in order to filter. In the past, I used collections, but I'll show you the difference between filter, excuse me, between collections and folders, and I'll tell you why I went to folders instead. So I'm going to open up Corel Font Manager, which is going to be under here, then Font Manager 2021. It's opening up on my other screen, so as soon as it opens, I'll move it over. I've really enjoyed using Font Manager to get my fonts organized and put the way that I want. In the past, Corel had a different program called, I want to say it was Bitstream's Font Manager, or Bitstream Font Navigator, I think is what it was called, Font Navigator. But they've replaced it with their own version that they've created here of Font Manager. And I've really liked it so far. Oops. Okay, so in Font Manager, over on the left, you can see there's folders here. If I close that down, you'll see collections. So by default, there are two collections, I believe. There's favorites and then my fonts. Actually, I don't know if my fonts is default or not. I don't know. Anyway, so what collections allow you to do is to go through your font list, and if you click on my fonts under folders, it's going to show all of the fonts that you have on your machine where it's looking. And so I can scroll through and see, all the different fonts. And if there's a font that I really like, I can either drag it over, just drag and drop it basically to favorites. So that's an option, is to drag and drop out of your font manager full list into a smaller list. Under the collections, if you create the add collection button and just say Cameron's fonts or something like that. Same thing, you go back to your full font folder, find the ones that you want, and then drag and drop them over into that folder. And that way they're going to show up in that list. So I used to do it that way until I decided it was actually easier for me to just manage a folder. So if you add a folder, it's going to go and look in your file structure for the specific folder that you're pointing to. So in this case, I have all of my monument specific fonts in folders so that I can just organize them that way. And I'm simply pointing to that folder. So if I wanted to see all the fonts that I'm able to use out of MoneyCAD, for instance, I can click on that and say select folder, and then it's going to show up under that folders list. As soon as I do that in Font Manager, it will show up now as a filter in CorelDRAW. So under my filter list, now I've got a MoneyCAD filter. So if I click on that, it's going to filter to only show those fonts. Sorry about that. I forgot to mute my phone. Okay. Now, obviously, it's only going to show those, in this case, 23 fonts. So I'm not going to have access to the rest of my fonts unless I go and clear those filters, right? So if I uncheck that, then it's going to go back to showing me all of them. You can, excuse me, you can do multiple. So if you wanted to, you can do MoneyCAD and Monument fonts and laser etch fonts. And so now it's just added those 3 filters together to show 164 available ones. By default, this list is actually pretty small. So if you grab anywhere on one of these, actually you must have to do it on the right hand side. If you grab it on the edge, you can click and drag that to be larger. So then you're able to see that text more. If you grab it from the bottom corner, you can, so I think by default, it actually starts at about this size, which is to me too small. So I drag and make it bigger. That way I'm able to see my full font names and my lists and everything like that. But that's how you do font filtering. Analia, does that answer the question on how to do that? I'm gonna use a cough drop here. One nice thing about font filtering is, obviously that you can limit it to just monument fonts or things that are set up the way that we work with in monuments, that sort of stuff. And so it's, especially for beginners, it's a nice thing to limit those fonts so that you're not showing, things that aren't going to work well with Sandblast. As soon as you've got your lists or your filters selected that you want, you can also just hide this and it's going to go back. And that way it's not going to show it all. All it's going to show is those. But it does mention up here that it's filtered so that you know it is not showing you the full list. One of the nice things too about Font Manager is you don't actually have to have the fonts installed in Windows for them to show up in CorelDRAW. If you look over here in Font Manager on the right hand side, these yellow, how those are yellow. The reason they're yellow is I don't have those installed. I just have a folder sitting there with those fonts inside of it. So it's different from these ones, for instance, that are actually installed in Windows. And some of these are green with a little lock on it because those are system fonts that come with Windows. So it's designating there some different things. It also shows, like this one here, it's got the VAR, that's for variable open type. This here is showing that it's duplicated, so I've actually got that font in multiple locations on my machine. If I right click on it, usually I thought it said it would show the location, but maybe not. Huh. I don't know. Anyway, so that's how I'd go about filtering my fonts is I personally just use folders now because I don't even need to come into Font Manager anymore once I do that. If I just set up the folders that I want and then download or create a font or whatever the case is, I just drop it in that folder and it's automatically going to watch inside that folder for new fonts. And so it will automatically add them right on the fly without me having to even go in and drag and drop and that sort of stuff. So that's the way that I like to do it. All right, so that's font filtering. Let's talk a little bit about the Bevel tool here, just because I was asked today how to show V-Sunk lettering without any lithochrome or any sort of paint. So if I had, say, a 24 by 12, and I added some text to it like this. By default, my text is black. Now there's a number of reasons that it is black. Number one is in the grayscale mode, black equals stain 1. So over here, these stains, they have to correlate back to a grayscale. And so 100% black correlates to stain number 1 here. So I always start out with black. But if black is not really accurate to how it's going to show up, you know, once this is created or on the actual stone, I'm going to show it 2 different ways here. I'm going to go with polish and I'm going to go with frost instead. So if I throw this Bahama blue on here, for instance, we'll see, you know, it's just black because it's pointing to stain 1, right? If I really wanted to show this as being V-sunk without any paint in it, there is the option to use the Bevel tool. So if I click on the text and hit the Bevel tool, it's going to add an effect. Basically, it's a 3D bevel effect to show that there's a little bit of depth to that lettering, so it casts shadows and that sort of stuff. But it's still pretty dark. So this is not exactly a beginner button. Like bevel is not something that I would normally tell beginners to use. So that's just a warning that this is more intermediate or higher level stuff than just beginner level stuff. But since it was asked, I thought it'd be good to talk about. So that's the quick and easy ways to hit the bevel button. All this button is doing is using the built-in bevel effect, which if we go to the Docker, the Bevel Docker, it's applying a soft edge to the center with 0 intensity, 45 direction, and 45 altitude. You can always mess with these numbers if you wanted to do it manually. And you'll see as I mess with these numbers, it changes the direction, right? If I mess with altitude, it changes how dark or how light that gets. So if I go with lower altitude, it's going to be not as dark, or it's going to be darker if I go with higher. So you can mess with those numbers. Intensity, again, is how bright that light is, the light color, the shadow color. Those are all things that you can mess with. The bevel button simply does that with those set numbers of 0, 45, 45, white shadow, white light. And that's what it's doing. Except if you have design work or panels. So if I brought in a panel, let's do this. We're going to use the new panel stuff just to make sure it works. We're going to build a panel to the inside. Double line is great. We'll do an offset of -1 inches. Apply that. Okay, so we've got a panel here now. And I guess we'll copy that over to the other side too. Grab all of these, copy it over, center it on there. I'm going to move this to the right. Okay, so what it does when you've got designs like this, because there's all these inside pieces, right? And then you got your very outside piece. So what it does in that case, and I'll move this out of the way just so that it doesn't mess with things. The other thing too is that in order for the bevels to work, I'm fairly certain you got to be in the grayscale mode. It's been a while since I've tried, but we're going to go back to grayscale for now. And we're going to grab these and bevel them. And doesn't look like. Well, like I ordered it correctly for some reason. So I might have to mess with that code there. But what it does in order to make it work with designs like this is it has to duplicate these pieces in order to combine them with the outside lines. And that creates then your V line in order to bevel the V line. If we didn't duplicate those pieces, then what ends up happening is your bevel would go all the way to the center of the object. So that would go, all the way to here, and it wouldn't look right at all. So in order for designs to work with bevel, it has to duplicate them, which means that if you were to cut this on a plotter, it's going to cut it twice because there's now this object and then the other one, which is creating that other line for the bevel. So that's a warning that if you use the bevel tool, make sure you know what you're doing and that you understand that it's creating duplicate pieces. And again, that's what the bevel tool up here is doing for you automatically based on whether or not it needs to. You're not going to get that sort of functionality just using the bevel docker. You would have to do it all manually. So the majority of Memorial Designer tools, what we're doing is we're automating functions that, would normally take, I don't know, 30 clicks or something and making it a single click. So we're adding in a bunch of ifs and thens and whatever behind the scenes. So it says, well, if it's text, just bevel it. If it's a design, then duplicate it, combine it, then bevel it. And so it's doing all that stuff for you in the background. But my point is that that's how it works. And still though, if we were to fill this back in, it still looks darker than if it were just no paint at all, right? So if we really wanted to go to a no paint look, we'd need to break this bevel apart from the rest of the design or from the text itself. So if we grab it, go up to object and say break bevel apart, or just hit Control K, which is the keyboard shortcut. What that does is it breaks that bevel, the beveled effect away from the original text. And so now we've got this, which is actually a bitmap, and we've got our original vector text. So to get it to show through or to not show any paint at all, because these are stacked with this one on top of this one, if I were to just grab the bitmap and put a transparency on it, it's going to actually get darker, which is the opposite of what I want to have happen. The reason for that is it's showing through to what's underneath it, which is the text, the black text, right? That's not what we want. So if we select the text, hold Alt and click, then what it does is it digs underneath my selection to the next thing under it, which happens to be the text. And we can tell it's the text because it's, showing up as text up here, showing down here that it's just a plain old black color. So if we grab that text, I don't delete it because I want the vectors to remain because that's what I'm going to cut, right? But what I can do is just get rid of the fill. So if I left click on the no fill option, it's going to not have a fill anymore. And now this is showing through to what's underneath, which happens to be the frosted portion. And so now it's showing through to that frost. And it's going to be more accurate to show, lettering without any polish in it. And you can adjust your transparency to be lighter or darker, based on how you want it to show up. So if I really wanted to show a customer what it would look like, that's what I would do, is I'd go through those steps. Not something I do often. More often than not, I'm just going to talk the customer through it or show them an actual example, because it does take a while to do it this way. But if it was a big, nice family monument or something, or something other than a grass marker, I probably would not do it on a grass marker. But if I was trying to show it to them on a big, column piece and whatever, then I'll take the extra time to do that, just because it's more realistic that way. But anyway, any questions on that? Have any of you ever actually used the Bevel tool before?
No, I've played with it a little bit, but never used it for anything.
It was, I mean, really, that was my whole use case, is just for this, to show V-Sunk lettering without lithochrome in it and have it look fairly correct. Anyway, but yeah, so it's not one that I would often use as a beginner, but since it was asked how to do, I figured we would talk about that there. All right, so I was thinking about just continuing along with Dockers and the different Dockers and what they do, if that's okay with everybody. There's a whole slew of Dockers, and I don't know that we'll cover all of them because some of them don't really have anything to do with what we do. But Tyler, who's usually in on these meetings, he was talking about the transform Docker, or not the Docker, but he was talking about transform the other day. So that's the one that I want to talk about today, is transform and how that works. And it doesn't mean that you turn into Optimus Prime or anything, but it does let you manipulate the way that your objects are. So if I were to draw an object, I've got a rectangle here. It gives me X, Y coordinates for the position, okay? And if I were to look at my rulers up here, so 0 is right here, and we've got 0 right here. So if I center this 0, 0, it's going to move the center of my object to that coordinate 0, 0. Okay. If I change my object origin to something else, it's going to give me a different number, because now it's talking about this corner up here as opposed to the center. So if you look at the numbers up here, it's showing negative 8.23 because that's half of the overall distance, right? And then it's 4.147, which is half of this distance. So that's why it's showing those coordinates. Now, if you wanted to, you could use the transform Docker over here to make copies. So let's say I want to make one copy, okay, and I hit apply. It should, let's see, I thought it would.
Cam, before you continue,
Go ahead.
I asked, does this also, this Bevel tool, does it also work on graphics itself? I guess you'd say believably, or does it kind of over exaggerate?
The Bevel tool only works on vectors. It's not going to work on bitmaps.
No, I meant vector graphics put into it.
Yeah, so like if you had like a bird or the pine tree or whatever sort of design you've got, it'll work on those as well. But again, it's going to duplicate the inside pieces in order to do it. So you have to realize that it's going to make a duplicate of those pieces. But yeah, it will. And the more difficult or the more complex it is, the longer it's going to take, because it is an actual, it's a pretty intensive effect. And so if you were doing it on a huge scene, I would expect it to take a while to do. And it might even slow down your system a little bit with, zooming in and out and that sort of stuff, because it is such a detailed effect. And you can, if you really want to do it, you can mess with your output resolution and stuff. By default, it's doing it at 300 dpi because that's what I have my my default rendering resolution at. But if you're only doing it on screen, you can lower that a bit and it will be faster than if you, you know, did 300 all the time. Because most of the time you don't really need it full size for print. We don't print things very often full size. Normally, if we're going to print things, we're going to make it really small, you know, like paper, just 8.5 by 11 or whatever. So even if you're on screen at 96 or 72 DPI, when you shrink it down to page size, it's already going to be, you know, larger than 300 DPI anyway, more than likely. So if it's something that you want to get into and use a lot, those are things to consider as well. But yeah, it will work on different things. I do not, however, have it set to work by default on white. I don't think I have it set to work on white stuff. So if I were to take this and instead make the text white instead of black, you'll see it doesn't, I mean, it just doesn't look right. And that's because the bevel settings for white versus black with your shadow and your light and that sort of stuff differ from what they would on black. And just off the top of my head, I'm not sure which ones would look better. It's probably shadow color, but I'd have to play with it to remember. So there you go. Shadow color makes difference. We probably want more intensity if it's white, you know, that sort of stuff. And again, white text. If I'm doing white lettering, most of the time I'm not V-syncing it. I'm just shallow cutting it. So I probably wouldn't do as much altitude either. But the default button anyway does not have the settings for being able to use white lettering or light lettering anyway. I have used this before, though, for like laser etching, because you can give your text, you know, an effect like this, and then you can laser etch that text so it appears from a distance to be casting a shadow like that, but it's not really engraved deep at all. It's just an effect. But anyway, and I do have a YouTube video on that too, on the YouTube channel of how I've done that before as well. Good question though, Derek. Okay, so let's get back to transformation. I don't actually use the transform docker very often. Oh, and no wonder it wasn't doing anything because it's rotating. We've got different tabs for the transformation docker: position, rotation, scale and mirror, size, and skew. So there's different options for what you want to do to transform this particular piece. And so if I were to have this as 8 by 8 to start with, I've got an 8 by 8. If I switch this to 16 and hit apply, it's going to switch it to 16 inches. Proportional is checked here. So because that's checked, it did both directions. If I uncheck it, it's only going to do it in one. That's similar to the lock ratio over here, but it's just doing it proportionally. So if you really wanted to mess with sizes and rotation and position of things, you can do that inside the Docker. One thing that it gives you inside the Docker, though, is something called relative position, which is a little different than this, because if I move this to, you know, if I wanted to move it over an inch, I would have to know to add an inch, you know, in both directions or one direction or whatever that case is. I can add that, but if this is a weird number, 14.25, to get it to move an inch, I'd have to add an inch to this number. So I would change it to 15.25 instead, right? Which isn't a big deal. But if I wanted to move it, I don't know, 3 1/4 inches, then I would have to do the math in order to figure out where exactly I need that to be. Whereas the transformation or the transform Docker gives you the option to do a relative position. So instead of the XY coordinates, the relative position gives you the ability to move in 3.25 inches away from where it currently is, not where it is on the XY coordinates. So that's what the relative position on the checkbox does. If you uncheck that, then it's going to show you the XYs for where it's actually sitting on the page. But this is relative. And if you change your object position over here, then that's going to differ as well, where it's moving from or moving to. So those are all things to pay attention to. The reason it was brought up by Tyler was because he was actually using the transform toolbar, which if you right click anywhere on a blank section of a toolbar, you'll see there are other toolbars that exist by default. We just don't use them. So there is a transform toolbar here. And on the transform toolbar, there is the option to do relative position. So there's your relative position checkbox. You'll see how it changes your numbers there. But he was messing around with stuff and didn't realize that the relative position button had been checked. So everything he was doing was relative to the existing object, as opposed to the just the XY. So in the Docker, it's, because it's just a button with no explanation unless you hover over it as to what it does, it's a little more difficult to understand what's going on there. So that's one thing to pay attention to if you're messing with these. Again, transform, not usually something that I would do as a beginner, because I find if you're a beginner, it's much easier to just use the options up here on the property bar, or to not even pay attention to the XY coordinates at all. That's the way that I prefer to do it, is not even really pay attention to those XY coordinates, unless it's very specific. So if I had a die and a base like this, and my base is at 0, by default, Shape Builder is going to put the bottom of your die at 0 there. So if I knew that I wanted a panel to be up from the bottom of my stone 2 inches, then it's pretty easy for me to grab this object origin, say 2 inches, and now I know that the bottom of my panel is 2 inches from the top, or from the bottom, sorry. So I can do that if I moved it over this way, right? This is where relative position can come into play. If I moved it over to the side, and I just dragged it and snapped it to the edge, but I could also select the die and just hit L to move it to the left, and that way they're going to be aligned to the left. So if I aligned it to the left, but I want to move it over 2 inches, I've shown you in the past how you can come up and change your nudge to 2. But if you don't ever want to mess with the nudge, if you like your nudge numbers and don't want to mess with those, then you can use transform instead and just say, hey, I want transform to move relative, from where this is at, I want to go over 2 inches, and it's going to then jump it over 2 inches. So now we've got it 2 inches from the side, 2 inches from the bottom, and that's without nudging. That's just moving it using the transform. Does that all make sense? I'm gonna read real quick in the chat and see what's. Amelia said, I have a question. Since yesterday, I have my Corel, which is very slow. Since I applied a fill, could it be because of this? Also, when I open a new drawing and I can no longer clean it, I can no longer reduce the nodes, everything freezes. And Aaron, thanks for answering, Analia, said, is it a new issue? It's been going on since you started the program. She said, it's new and I don't often use the fill. So the question is, I guess, Analia, when you mention you applied a fill, is it a specific fill or is it any fill that's giving you the problem or being slow? And like Aaron said, have you closed the program out and reset it, or have you closed your computer down and reset it? Those are all things that I would try to do, especially if something's working slowly. And if it just started happening out of the blue, I would also pay attention to Windows updates and see if you got maybe a new driver update or Windows update. They like to, update those on Tuesdays or Wednesdays. So that can often happen too, that different things can mess with the program. So that's what I would try. I want to talk a little bit about fills and Annalie, have you reset your computer at all since then? If I have something that's filled black, right? We talked about this earlier, that if I have something black, it's going to point to black in the stain color. So if I fill this in, this black then now becomes stain 1, which in the past, if I grabbed that and changed it to white and filled it, or if I had something like this that was 10% gray and was filled with frost, and then I took that same object and made it black, and then I refilled. In the past, what would happen is this frosted object remembered that it was frosted, and it would then refrost the design once it was being filled. So we've been working on getting that that logic fixed, so that if it's black, it's just going to stay black, or if it's black, it's always going to go to stain 1, as opposed to going back to the way that it originally was. And so a lot of people had issues because oftentimes you'll be filling, you'll have a design where you're filling things in. So if I had brought in, let's just say this bird design, if I brought this in and ended up welding it to this, for instance, if I took this bird design and welded it to this, or I'm trying to think how it would, I grab this and weld it to that, it's not really going to happen. But when you're combining different pieces, they can inherit the characteristics of the pieces you weld to. So I was trying to do that backwards. I guess what it would really be is if I had this already filled with a color, and then I took my panel and welded it. And anyway, you can inherit those pieces or the way that that's filled in. And so in the past, when you would restore your fills, it would end up filling in the way that it used to be, even if we had changed these colors. So even if we went like this and made that white, then we went to fill it in again, instead of being white, it would fill in with the frost or whatever it used to be. So we've been working on fixing that, and so far it's looking good. So if that's an issue that you've had before and would like to see if we can get that fixed on your end, let me know if you want to test it out, and we can go from there. Aaron mentions that he only applies fill at the very end of doing his design work, and then Derek also mentioned here to forget fills so that the file sizes don't get too large. And those are all definitely good things to do. I myself do the same thing where I will work in grayscale almost entirely until I'm completely at the end of my design. Just because it's much easier to work in grayscales and make sure that everything is the way that it needs to be. And once the grayscales are all good, then it's just a single click to get your other pieces to work. If I were to do it half and half, where this is filled in and the rest is grayscale, it still doesn't look right. And I'd have to end up filling things differently later anyway. So I find it easier to just work in grayscales to begin with.
Hey, I was just thinking, Cameron,
Yep.
if she's having a problem with that, isn't there an option somewhere to have the fills be reapplied once you open the file instead of saving them with the file?
Yep.
And maybe that's what she's got going on.
So under settings here in the Docker, at the bottom of the fills section, there is the option to restore fills after save. I have that by default checked, because what that does is if you don't check that, then when you save your drawing, let's save this. When you save your drawing, if you don't have that checked, what it does is it will, or it should, I guess I should really get out of that dialog before I do anything. Okay. Let's try this here. Save it. If you remove the fills, it's going to take those fills out to save it to a make it so that the file size is smaller. But in older versions of Memorial Designer, it would just do this, and anytime you saved, it would just go back to the grayscale. So if you're working on a filled design, it kind of got annoying that you'd have to go in and refill things because just because you saved the file. So by default now, it is set to restore that granite fill after you save it. So now it would restore it after I save. So if I make a little change and save my file, then it's going to save it. It still removes the fills, but then it restores the fills after it's done saving so that it's still showing filled while I'm working on it. I don't know that that's necessarily the problem. Definitely could be, but Annalie, I think what I'll do is I'll just get on your machine later and see if we can diagnose what's going on for you as to why it's being slow. Most of the time though, I mean, unless your system is, really not that great at all, fills should not slow things down very much, if at all, just because they're tiling, and so they're not taking up a whole lot of system resources. But I'll get on there later and we'll see if we can figure that out for you. So anyway, if you've ever run into that with fills, we are working on getting that fixed. So far, so good. I think it's going to work out well. But that is something that has popped up quite often with people, just because you'd expect it to work one way and it has been working differently. So by default, I'm going to not have it ask me to remove the fills on save. I just want it to remove them. That's going to save me disk space. I'm going to have it automatically restore them after I save. That way it doesn't change the look while I'm working on it. So that would be a good, Derek does mention though that the file size can get big. Sometimes if your fills are getting embedded into that file, which should not happen. If I go to open this design and look at this test file, it's only 30 kilobytes, which is very small and manageable, right? That's the way that it should be. It should really be less than 100 kilobytes for the most part. But if those granite fills get embedded into that file, it can quickly become larger. I'll show you one way to do that on purpose. Not that I would want to, but if I take everything here and I tell it to forget fills, what that does is it basically tells it to forget that these fills correlate with the grayscales. And so it's going to not remember anymore that those were supposed to be, you know, have the ability to go back to grayscales. And so now if I save this file, more than likely it's going to mess that up. Prompt to, yeah, so let's look at the file size now and see. There we go. So now all of a sudden it's 12 megabytes. The reason it's so large is because those fills are now part of the document. It's not pulling them out anymore when it saves. And if I wanted to change the colors, I can't change the colors because it no longer remembers that those were filled with certain colors. Even if I go back here and reapply the grayscales the way that they're supposed to be. So even if I go back and refill this, however I wanted it filled, right? And then I fill it again and save it. We'll see if it made it smaller that time. Oh, it did. So that's good. So it went back, at least in 2021, it goes back. In older versions, especially like 2018, if those files have been embedded, sometimes they stay there without, you know, being able to pull them back out. So it's good to see that in 2021, it's at least pulling those back out, which is nice. But that's where file sizes can quickly get larger if something's messed up, and or if you accidentally, you know, told it to forget the fills while it's filled, because that then makes it so that those fills become part of that image or part of that graphic for you. So anyway, we'll get on there and see what's going on. Sorry that it's not working very well. Computers can be pretty finicky sometimes.
What would you like to play next?
I just have the word computer, so my
I'm not
devices
sure.
are just talking to me. Okay. Is there any questions on any of that stuff that we covered today? No? All right. Got about 5 more minutes till we hit the hour, so I don't know that if we start anything new, we're gonna have enough time. So I think those were the things that I wanted to talk about today.
I got a quick question for you, Cameron. The previous weeks, are you still going to upload those to YouTube?
Yeah, the reason I didn't is because we traveled, and then also some of those, if you remember, I had typed in some stuff that had my passwords.
Yep.
So I have to go back and edit those, which takes a little bit more time than just simply uploading them.
Gotcha. Okay, I figured there was something along those lines, so I just wanted to check.
Yep. Hopefully, I think today I've got some time, so hopefully I can get them uploaded today. I want to say that there's 2 or 3 that I need to do. So
Sounds about right.
I will get those done as soon as I can. And yeah, good question. Wednesday's working out for everybody so far?
Yeah, as much as any other day.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we will keep it this way. We'll stick with Wednesdays for now. And if you have anything for next week, just let me know. Otherwise, we will see you same time next week.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Yep. Have a good one.
See you guys.